guys, welcome back for another WSQ. Today we're going to be looking at the civil rights movement. As you watch the video, please make sure that you're answering the guided questions provided to you on your WSQ sheet. If you need to pause or rewatch the video, make sure that you do that while you're watching. When the video ends, make sure that you summarize the main points of the video using paragraph form. The specific vocabulary given to you on your WSQ sheet will show up as bold and underlined words during the video. Then finish by asking one question, something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question for the class. The essential question that we're studying in this video is how did new movements for civil rights and liberal efforts expand the role of government and generate a range of cultural and political responses? Foreign historians will analyze relationships among different social, ethnic, and racial groups and how these groups sought to change American society and institutions. During the civil rights movement, there was quite a few different organizations that came out of other organizations that had already been formed. During the 1940s, the CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, sought to end discrimination through nonviolent tactics. Their tactics are going to be continued on through other organizations. In addition to that, the NAACP had started to challenge segregation laws as violations of the 14th Amendment, saying that African Americans were not provided equal protection under the law. Thurgood Marshall was going to be the leader of this team, challenging Plessy versus Ferguson, showing that Plessy versus Ferguson was not separate but equal. The NAACP is going to first focus on segregation in schools. They're going to combine a lot of their segregation efforts into one larger Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, which was in 1954. Chief Justice Earl Warren announced a unanimous decision that struck down segregated public schools as unconstitutional. The decision at the Brown versus Board of Education had a ripple effect throughout the rest of the United States, especially in the South. The southern states were pretty slow to change because the court didn't require any guidance or give any sort of enforcement to it. The governor of Arkansas delayed a court order to integrate the local high school, Little Rock High School. And he used the National Guard to turn away the Little Rock nine students who were trying to integrate that particular high school. The students were harassed and bullied by the white community. In the picture above, you can see the Little Rock 9 waiting to get into the high school. President Eisenhower eventually sends the National Guard to protect the students and integrate the high school following the court order. In 1955, Rosa Parks, who was the secretary of the NAACP, challenged the segregation law in buses by sitting in the first row of the black section and refusing to move when the white section filled up. She was arrested for this, and the NAACP called for a boycott of the bus system until the buses were desegregated. Rosa Parks is not the first person to challenge this law, and it also wasn't because she was just tired. Rosa Parks actually had been part of a larger ploy in order to challenge these segregation laws. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as the movement's leader, and the Supreme Court finally ruled that the segregated buses were unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott led to a series of boycotts of other racist policies throughout the South. Out of this, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference formed to organize these protests and then elected Martin Luther King as the leader. The group is committed to the nonviolent protest and also civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is when you purposely break the law just because you think it is unjust. February 1st of 1960, 4 students at North Carolina State of Agricultural and Technology began a sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina at Woolworth's, a very popular department store in downtown Greensboro, to protest segregation at lunch counters. The event came known as the Greensboro SitIn. The white community was very, very upset about the new policy, wanting to keep the lunch counters segregated. But the protests continued throughout the South at lots of different colleges and universities or in areas where African American population was high. By the fall, most lunch counters across the South are desegregated. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was an organization started by African American students who wanted to nonviolently protest the discrimination, and they focused primarily on the sit-ins and other nonviolent methods of protest. Also in the summer of 1960, the Freedom Rides were led by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, to end segregation on the interstate bus system. These were the buses that traveled between the different states, mainly going to be the Greyhound bus. Freedom Riders included white and black students. And as they moved farther into the South, the buses and the riders were attacked. In the top right-hand corner, you can see one of the buses that was attacked by protesters. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who was the brother of JFK, arranged for the governor of Alabama to have police protect rioters in Montgomery. But the governor of Alabama was a very racist man, and he did not have them show, and so the rioters were beaten. And so Kennedy instead sent in federal marshals to protect the rioters. The riots continue into the fall of 1961, when finally the Interstate Commerce Commission integrated the different stations. James Meredith also continued with the desegregation trend and was the first African American student to integrate a college or university at the University of Mississippi in 1962. He had to be escorted at all times by 50 federal marshals. When he was sent in, there was a huge riot and many troops had to be sent in, resulting in a lot of hurt and violence. The federal marshals stayed with him the entire time that he was at the University of Mississippi. In April of 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, there was a series of sit-in and marches to protest segregation. Hundreds were arrested. White clergy were criticized Martin Luther King Jr. for his tactics. While he was in jail, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail addressing his critics and how protests and nonviolent protests was the only way that things could change. When the momentum movement ran low on adult marchers, the SCLC trained high school, college, and elementary school students to march. They trained them in the ways to avoid getting hurt during the protests. Chief Eugene Bull Connor used dogs and fire hoses on the marchers, and the American public watched the incident on television, horrified at the violence being used against young people. Eventually, the federal government ends up stepping in to force integration. In order to build support for the new Ned Legislation, civil rights leaders planned a march on Washington in August of 1963. Over 200,000 people attended, and Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. The next month, in September, a bombing at a Birmingham, Alabama church killed 4 young African-American females. When Kennedy is assassinated in November, Johnson steps in to finish the passage of the bill and signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that bans discrimination in employment and public accommodations, successfully ending segregation. Civil rights leaders also began to focus on voting in the South because African Americans still were being discriminated against in the voting booths. If you remember, back from the beginning of 1900s, African American voters were not able to vote because of the poll tax, because of literacy tests, and the grandfather clause, and these tests get progressively harder. They began to focus on the Voter Education Project by the SCORE and SNCC, trying to register Southern African Americans to vote. Many of these marchers are attacked, several of the workers go missing. The project overall is a success, and they're able to register more than 1.5 million voters in the first year. By 1962, the 24th Amendment was passed that banned poll taxes. But in the summer of 1964, they started Freedom Summer. During Freedom Summer, they started to mass register voters in the South. Some volunteers registered voters, but others taught in freedom schools to help teach African Americans basic reading and math skills. Within a week, 3 volunteers had disappeared, and 2 months later, their bodies were found in an earthen dam. The protesters, the people who did the crime, were mainly KKK members and were never actually accused of anything. The state drops the charges, so the federal government prosecutes them, giving them 4 to 10 years in jail, of 7 out of the 21. In January 1965, the focus is mainly going to be on voting rights, and so they start in Selma, Alabama. He uses marches and mass jailing to bring attention to the issue. A marcher was killed in Marion, Alabama. King arranged a march from Selma to Montgomery, trying to protest police brutality. 600 African-American protesters joined the march and were attacked by police crossing Edmund Pettus Bridge. After that, more white clergymen and also federal agents are sent in to protect the marchers from attack. A week after the march, Lyndon B. Johnson asked Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave federal government the power to keep states from preventing African Americans from voting. The movement had helped alleviate de jure segregation, or segregation by law, but mainly people's attitudes had not changed. People were still just as racist as they were before. Most places, especially the North, suffered from de facto segregation, meaning by practice or custom, which is harder to fight. This included job discrimination and housing. There was a lot of frustration over de facto segregation because African Americans were still experiencing the same kinds of discrimination before, but it's hard to prevent these based on law. There was a lot of race riots, especially the Watts riots in Los Angeles. After the riots, LBJ appointed the Kerner Commission, trying to find the study of what was happening in these urban areas and why the violence was occurring. And the Kerner Commission mainly blamed it on poverty and discrimination. The African American civil rights movement was fractured between two movements, the Black Panther Party and also the nonviolent movement. Stokely Carmichael, who had been the head of SNCC, started to abandon nonviolence. Stokely Carmichael encouraged black power, or depending only on the African American community for change. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale also came together to form the Black Panther Party in Oakland. They were protecting the African American community from police brutality. They carried guns and guarded the community overall. The Black Muslims were led by Elijah Muhammad. This movement preached black nationalism, kind of similar to black power, and self-discipline and self-reliance. Malcolm X was one of the most popular black Muslims. He was critical of nonviolence, but he was assassinated in 1965 by followers of Elijah Muhammad who felt like he had gotten too big. King realized the movement needed to focus more on economic issues as well, because African Americans were disproportionately poor as well. So he went to Memphis, Tennessee to support sanitation workers striking for better paying conditions. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by James Earl Ray off his hotel balcony. Riots erupted throughout the United States, and there was a lot of riots against this because they thought the government plotted it. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 followed his death, which banned discrimination in sale or rental of housing. Courts also began ordering the use of buses to integrate schools that were plagued by de facto segregation or white flight, in which African Americans only went to schools where there were no white folks because they left. In Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg, they ordered that busing for integration is constitutional to give every student the right. Affirmative action was also passed, which gave preference to minority and female applicants for colleges and jobs, and led to a shift among white, Southern, and urban working-class whites to the Republican Party. Throughout the 1970s, African Americans became increasingly active in politics, and politicians like John Lewis and Andrew Young came to serve as ambassadors in Congress. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, there was also a revival of the women's movement. A lot of women started joining the workforce. However, they were not paid equally to what men were, and so President Kennedy ordered a report on the status of women. Women still married pretty young, about 20, and not all women were happy to stay at home, though. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963, talking about how many women felt trapped by being homemakers and the expectations that society kept on them. She also created the National Organization for Women, the NOW Party, that would fight discrimination and violence against women and also fight for abortion rights or the right to regulate a woman's body. These ideas became known as feminism, where women were socially, politically, and economically equal to all other people. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had banned discrimination based on sex, but it's not going to be well enforced. Women started passing the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA amendment, that still hasn't been passed to this day, but it runs into a lot of opposition in the South. In the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court struck down laws that banned abortion as a violation to the constitutional right of privacy. This remains one of the biggest controversial rights that women continue to have. By the end of the 1970s, the number of women that held professional jobs increased, with many white and middle-class women benefiting. Native Americans were also discriminated against during this time period. They didn't have the same prosperity, and they also had a high unemployment rate. The main thing that happened to Native Americans was termination, or when the reservation system was ended, and they encouraged Native Americans to move to cities and join mainstream society. But they didn't provide the services to support Native Americans, and so Native Americans opposed this. The other group that was also discriminated against in society is Latinos. Immigration increased in the United States because of the Immigration Act of 1965, which gave preference to immigrants with relatives that were already in the United States. About a third of Latinos lived below the poverty line, and 80% of them worked in low-paying, unskilled work like farm labor or construction. There's a lot of discrimination in schools, and an unproportionate amount of Latino Americans dropped out. One of the main leaders of the Latino movement was Cesar Chavez, who led a strike and national boycott. He worked for better pay and working conditions for Latinos. The strike is going to be very successful, and other Latino Americans are also going to start fighting for their rights. Thank you for joining me for this WSQ. Make sure that you answered the guided questions, that you summarized the main points, and that you ask one question as the video ends. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you in class.